It was the night of October 4th. I was summoned to the regiment commander's office. At 3 o'clock in the morning we go to the right bank of the Dnieper. Suddenness decides everything. Every minute is precious. We are forcing the Dnieper without artillery preparation. Heavy artillery is lagging behind. The battery supports the 1st Rifle Battalion. To hold the bridgehead at all costs. On the downdrafts rolled guns were the first to push off the shore. Somewhere to the right flashed fire flares, imitated the crossing unnoticed. They entered the right bank and felt the sand crumbling and falling under their feet. We dug trenches every 3 to 5 meters. From the morning cold all squeezed to the wet sand. The landing force was visible as on the palm of the hand from the steeps. Scout planes with white crosses appeared in the sky. At noon, the earth and sky shuddered, the airplanes chiseled the ground. The roar of the engines was joined by an incredible soul-crushing screech. It seemed that this sound was like a bayonet pointing at your chest and was about to pierce you. Machine gunners opened fire on the planes. One plane was hit. It caught fire and fell into the Dnieper. Our reconnaissance returned with nothing. There were minefields ahead, wire barriers, and then steep cliffs. There was nothing to think about an attack. Entered fascists threw machine gunners at us. Guns and mortars opened fire from the heights. When the machine gunners approached us, we went into hand-to-hand combat. Everything was mixed up. The attack was repulsed. The 3rd day was over. The men held on. The fog was slowly descending. The enemy planes continued to harass us, and barely had the fire from the steep subsided, the Tigers came at us. The machine gunners jumped off the tanks, scattered, lay down. We fired to cut off the Nazis from the tanks, and the Tigers crawled on us. The battery was firing at the tanks. The Tiger exploded. Changed before my eyes, the 7th attack of Tigers. The sand was moaning, shouting with a living scream. Everywhere you look, red from blood bandages, scattered corpses. Heavy wounded moaned Dnieper. There were 3 men left in the battery. Spiridona tanks were irrigating the trenches. Tiger noticed our 3rd gun and as if reluctantly turned around. And then Palivada clutched in his hands 2 mines, picked up at night, threw himself under the tracks. The tank shuddered from the explosion, but managed to fire. The explosion destroyed many. Fighting for the bridgehead continued. A. Pozharov recalled all this. The typewritten parts of his story, they were 18, and are kept in Kremenchug Secondary School, no. 11. An extract from it was sent to me by a veteran of our division, former commander of the 244th Section of the Fighter Anti-Tank Division of the 375th Rifle Division, retired Major Mikhail Zakharovich Zinchenko. I had to meet with General Govoronenko. He was strict, they were afraid of him. Even now I look at his portrait and seem to be afraid of him. And he had a saying, slacker, if he didn't like someone in a combat situation. And he led the battle beautifully. How do I know that? A simple paramedic. Dnieper, the bridgehead, hell. In the middle of the battle, our trench, or rather a sprinkled sand ditch, because in the sand a trench is not possible, approached next to a log cabin, from which General Govoronenko commanded the battle. The shell, mine is harder to find a deserted place. Everywhere people, losses are heavy in killed. Comrade General, tanks are close. Calm down, dear girl. The anti-tank guns are bringing them to a straight line. D. Govorenko calms her down. Liaison, Comrade General, the guns are covered with sand. What to do? Govoronenko orders a hand-to-hand fight. Bayonet and spatulas. We survived, but it couldn't be. Now I hear the Sheikh. Medic, come here. I'm in the General's dugout. Someone from the command was wounded. Tall, blonde, as I see now. He's wounded badly in the head, neck, shoulder. I examined him. No pneumothorax in the chest, no penetrating pneumothorax in the abdomen, no pulse is weak. The wounded man asks for water, but they don't give it to him. They are afraid not to harm him. Bandaged him. I demanded immediately. Give water. He has lost a lot of blood. Let him drink, and the more the better, so as not to weaken the heart. Here I also began to administer cardiac and anti-shock drugs. I found myself the master of my position in the General's dugout. The wounded man was reviving before my eyes. I had to bring him out of pre-shock state, and I did. Govoronenko looked at my work in a special way. Some special look, not a general's look. In that battle I pulled out and evacuated across the Dnieper many seriously wounded regiment. Giving in to memories, the soul becomes lighter. You evaluate today in a different way. Dozens of years have passed, and I am convinced people doing big things, it turns out, have big souls. Vasily Vasilievich Sheludev was our chief of medical service at that time. 31 years later, when he gathered us in Kharkov, he turned out to be a great soulful friend on equal terms. He wrote to me as well as to all our comrades, as a brother, as a relative, as a heartfelt comrade, and when he was gone, we took the loss as a heavy personal grief. Your book was the fruit of your great generosity of spirit. My year is Jubilee on October 6, 1982. I am 60 and 60 years of Soviet power. I think whether I lived correctly, whether I did everything and how I did it. I want to pass a lot of things to the young, but not always succeed. After the artillery preparation, very weak shots from guns and mortars were heard from the enemy. Our commanders, having decided that the fascists' fire points were suppressed, raised their units to the attack, without tank support, firing on the move with automatic rifles. Rifles rushed to the front edge of the enemy defense. The Germans, having let ours at a close distance, opened heavy fire. The soldiers lay down entrenched. From the testimony of the prisoners, the enemy's cunning became clear. Hitlerites received an order to hold Novo-Grigoreva at any cost and to be ready for a counterattack to throw back the Reds behind the Dnieper, so they decided to pretend to be crushed. The Germans had not yet had time to rise to the counterattack, as the divisional and supporting artillery, Katyusha, covered them with their fire. The battle for the first line of enemy defense began. A group of soldiers led by the battalion commissar of the 1241st Rifle Regiment, Sergeant Krivov, after a short hand-to-hand fight, cleared from the Germans a part of the first trench and rushed to the second. With the cry, "Hurrah, hurrah!" rushed forward and other units. Hitlerites rose in a counterattack. Hand-to-hand fighting began. At repulsion of the Hitlerites' counterattack, the machine gun company of the 1241st Rifle Regiment of the Communist Lieutenant Ignatkov especially distinguished itself. The company, having let the Germans at close distance, met them with fire of all machine guns. When the first and second numbers of one machine gun were wounded, the lieutenant himself lay down behind the machine gun and mowed down the enemy with accurate fire. The enemy counterattack was repulsed, for skillful leadership, resourcefulness and initiative, shown in the last battles. Lieutenant Ignatkov, already awarded 2 orders of Patriotic War II degree, and the Order of the Red Star, was presented to the award of the 4th Order, the Order of the Red Banner. In this battle, Red Army man of the 1243rd Rifle Regiment, Polninsky, when the Germans counterattacked, went to their flank and opened fire with a machine gun. Next to him, the machine guns of Komsomol member Rogov and others were slinging. The Germans, taking their fire for a counterattack in the flank, rolled back. For initiative and heroism, they were awarded orders. A reflection of an enemy counterattack gunner of 45mm gun Komsomolets Vasiliev hit a tank, was awarded. Mortarman Hamat Sharipov suppressed 3 machine gun points of the enemy. Sergeant Vladimir Svistyanov, a squad commander, shot down a tank. On the left flank of the enemy, fire noticeably weakened. Platoon Babin, taking advantage of this, as well as the retreat of counterattackers, decisive rush broke into the trench of the Germans. The first jumped Komsomolets Kazin Ivan, knocked down one Naisi and took him prisoner. Sabitov's squad ran along the message, and Privates Pavlov and Pakhomov caught up with several fleeing Germans and finished them off. The platoon completely cleared the Hitlerites from the trench and entrenched itself in it. The enemy quickly came to his senses and opened fire on our units. It seemed that bullets pierced every meter of the ground. A hot battle began. A group of scouts of a separate Renaissance company under the command of Petty Officer Kuznetsov, consisting of Senior Sergeant Efimov, Sergeant Davidov, Privates Shevchenko and Pinzev, having waited for the moment, rushed to the junction of enemy units for language. The Krauts, stunned by the sudden appearance of the Red Army, afraid of encirclement, scattered. The senior of the group, Kuznetsov, threw a grenade at a machine gun crew. Having knocked down one Kraut with a blow of the automatic rifle, tied his hands. Other scouts, having killed 13 fascists, took one more prisoner. Having taken a machine gun and 2 prisoners, they returned to their place without losses. In the afternoon of October 21, the division commander Major General Govorenko gathered regimental commanders and their deputies in political department. The question was discussed, how to better and faster take possession of Novo-Grigoreva. There was a lively exchange of opinions. Taking into account the current situation, General Govorenko decided to attack Novo-Grigoreva at night. After that, I decided to visit several regiments, and everywhere I saw how the soldiers, despite the fatigue from long battles on the sandy bridgehead, were ready to go into battle again. It was necessary to check the morale and material preparation for night actions, to direct the hot soldiers' impulse in the right direction, to hold short briefings of party leaders, Komsomol leaders and agitators, to talk to communists, Komsomol members and soldiers about the necessity of a rapid attack, to organize an explanation of how to use light signals, rockets, tracer bullets. The Soviet troops pursued the enemy relentlessly in order not to give him the opportunity to withdraw in an organized manner and to turn the rich Ukraine into ruins. Darkness moved in from the east, crowding daylight farther west. The boundless deep sky above us was dotted with flashing stars. Wisps of purple clouds slowly stretched out, followed by dark blue clouds that covered both the stars and the moon. The dark night covered us well, making it difficult for the enemy to observe. I went with the 1245th Rifle Regiment, where a new regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Ivanovich Nadeshkin, had just been appointed instead of Lieutenant Colonel Arsenty Nikolaevich Kalinin, who died on the bridgehead. Nikolai Ivanovich was born in the village of Zaboloti, Yaroslavl region. Before the war, he worked in Kharkov Military School as a commander of a cadet company, a tactics teacher. He was a year older than me, had 4 daughters and 2 sons. Our artillery began to speak, bringing down deadly fire on the enemy. The sky lit up with flashes from the shots and bursts of shells. The air was mixed with gunpowder smoke. The battery of Fyodor Kizhniakov's division was firing at the buildings where the Nazis were huddled. The night battle took a fierce character. On the approaches to the village there was a hiccup. The regiment commander aimed the 1st Battalion where, hiding behind fences, houses, fired guns and machine guns of the enemy. Sergeant Kozlov's squad moved on a ledge, just behind the platoon of Junior Lieutenant Sharshov, who came under fire from enemy machine guns. "Look, Sergeant, look. We must help," hurried Sergeant Kozlov, Assistant Platoon Commander Borisov. "I see. Machine gun firing from under the outermost house." The squad opened fire with rifles and automatic rifles. But the machine gun continued to pour its fire on the platoon. The sergeant swore angrily and, armed with grenades, crawled forward. The soldiers intensified their fire to help the sergeant to approach the enemy machine gun from the side. A precise throw of grenades, and the machine gun choked. At the same moment, the enemy's machine gun burst. Sergeant Kozlov fell almost next to the enemy machine gun. Ivan Polikarpov's rifle battalion went on the attack, and at 24:00 on October 22 broke into the outskirts of Novo-Grigoreva. It was dawn. Far in the east, the red glow of the rising sun was blazing. In the pre-morning dawn, the twinkling stars were going out. The sky was bare of clouds. Germans beat from attics and windows, from the corners of buildings. So here the success of the battle depended on the bravery and courage of the fighters, daring and proactive actions of small groups. From the windows of one house, the enemy machine gunners were shooting. Private Samoilov crawled up to the house and from the corner threw 2 grenades into the window, one after another. Hitlerites became silent. For direct fire, the Germans on the trailer of a car pulled the gun to the crossroads of the street. It was noticed by machine gunners Gomels and Ivanov. They rushed in front of the car. The fascists had no time to turn the gun, as Gomels and Ivanov opened fire from the machine gun and threw grenades at them. The enemy gun was put out of action. Lieutenant Vaskov, fighting with his platoon in the street, found a camouflage tank in a barn. He crawled up to the shed and threw an anti-tank grenade. The enemy vehicle was blown up as the Germans repeatedly counterattacked, trying to retake the village. Our artillerymen, mortarmen, machine gunners shot the counterattacking fascists at point-blank range, so repelling counterattacks and taking possession of house after house. The soldiers of the division on October 23, 1943 captured Novo-Grigoreva, a village of the right bank Ukraine, from the fascist invaders and, continuing the offensive, released under Spenskio. When the battle subsided, the battalion Commissar Krivov took out of the pocket of Kozlov's gymnoskeleton a Komsomol ticket drenched with blood. Kozlov was buried according to military custom near the village Pavlish. The soldiers stood at the grave of their battle friend and swore to beat the sworn enemy mercilessly. In the battles on the bridgehead from October 4 to October 30, 1943, the division's units hit 12 tanks, smashed 5 guns, 17 mortars, 52 machine guns and hand machine guns, destroyed 20 bunkers, destroyed a lot of enemy manpower, 1 gun, 15 machine guns, 188 rifles, 2 grenade launchers, a lot of shells, mines, ammunition, and other military property. A reed-covered river snakes along. On its steep sandy bank there are trenches camouflaged by autumn-yellowed foliage. Not far beyond the river, among the fading and blackened from shell bursts trees, scarlet, miraculously preserved aspen trees are burning with fires. It is evident that the battles here were hot. Bombs and shells scattered everywhere mangled enemy machine guns and guns. Near lies our dear battle friend, the favourite of our fighting family. The commander of the calculation, Sergeant Boris Kasko, said the part of the mortar battery, Petty Officer Zenat Kusnitanov, pointing to a fresh hillock of earth with a plywood red star, made hastily by Nikolsky. The soldiers of the battery said goodbye to their friend. Kasko, almost 2 years together with us, shared all the hardships of war, increased the glory of the battery with his exploits. He is not with us now. Farewell, battle friend. Alexei Viradov, who uttered these words, had his throat constricted, his heart almost froze. He gave his life, liberating this Ukrainian village, Pavlish, added Partuk Zenat. Mortars consider it. Blood and life won from the enemy, there are... So the life of our friend, said Nikolsky. You will take revenge. They will pay for it with dozens of their black lives. Mortar battery has always been characterized by its cohesion, discipline. It was a fighting-friendly family, consisting of people of different nationalities. Cohesion, strengthened in the fire of battles, always gave it strength, ensured success on the battlefield. Common work, common interests, common responsibility for the fate of the fatherland, that's what united the mortars. The battery brought up steadfast, skillful warriors. Alexei Viradov started the war as a private. Time passed. The war taught him many things. To fight, to hate the enemy, to respect people, to be steadfast. Now Alexei Alexandrovich became a senior lieutenant, platoon commander, a good educator, an order-bearer. Sergeants Barabashev, Zaitsev, Nikolsky, Private Sheimakov, gunners Usmanov, Sharapov became skillful soldiers. All of them were awarded orders, medals, badges, excellent mortar man. Mutual aid, comradely support in battle became the law of their lives. Each of them can replace any number of the calculation. They hit one goal, to defeat the enemy. Each of them cherishes his unit and its successes. Friendship, hard to survive the loss of combat friends. In one battle, Junior Sergeant Bashkir Alfitunov was wounded. He was sent to the hospital. By the end of treatment, he applied to the head of the hospital with a request for discharge. But he was refused, as the wound had not yet completely healed. Then Alfitunov, catching a convenient moment, ran away from the hospital. After walking dozens of kilometers, he crossed the Dnieper independently and excitedly reported to Officer Borshevsky. Comrade Lieutenant, Alfitunov has returned from the hospital. Sishuvash Sheimanov did the same. One cool evening he went out for a walk, and he was never seen in the hospital ward again. When Sheimanov reached the battery, he wrote to the hospital, "Don't look for me. I am at my own, at the front." Continuing the offensive and not giving the enemy the opportunity to gain a foothold on the intermediate lines. By December 10, the division with heavy fighting reached the line. Strimovka, Nerubaika, Sibulevo, where it went to the defense and joined the 4th Guards Army. We were glad that we left the 53rd Army, but our joy was short-lived. About it a little later. The division was replenished with men and military equipment, put itself in order and began to prepare for the offensive. Much time was devoted to political and educational work with the new recruits, who consisted mainly of residents of the newly liberated towns and villages of Ukraine. They studied combat traditions, heroic feats of the division soldiers. Much work was carried out on the placement of party and Komsomol forces, strengthening the party and Komsomol organizations of units. They helped them to master combat equipment and weapons, taught them how to act in battle. All the work was aimed at the successful fulfillment of combat tasks to educate the soldiers' high offensive impulse. After all, the battles were to be heavy. At the end of December, the division went on the offensive. The weather and terrain for the offensive were unfavorable. Rain, wet snow, numerous streams, ravines with steep slopes, large settlements prepared by the enemy for defense. Despite this, the division began to move forward successfully, participated in the battles for the liberation of the towns of Znamenka, Kirovograd, opposing the enemy in its direction of strongly fortified lines, drove him deep into the right bank Ukraine. In these battles, the personnel showed high combat training, organization, courage, and persistence. The 1,245th Infantry Regiment had to break through the Hitlerite defense and take possession of the village Krasnosilka. Using the favorable positions, the enemy built here powerful fortifications. In the first echelon of the regiment was to attack the battalion of Captain Ivan Galagan. When making a decision, the battalion commander experienced great difficulty, as the terrain in front of the enemy defences was open, and the enemy could easily pierce their fire offensive from a distance. Combat was looking for a way to save men and at the same time for the successful fulfillment of the combat task. How to proceed? Frontal offensive did not promise success. Sent a group of scouts consisting of a communist petty officer Kuznetsov and Private Serebryakov, Sularov, Pinkov, Garin brought a tongue, which gave valuable information about the system of fascist defences. In addition, on reconnaissance of the terrain was noticed hollow, similar to a shallow ravine, and went to the flank of the enemy defence. The battalion commander, having weighed all the pros and cons, made a risky decision to leave a reinforced rifle platoon dispersed in front of the enemy front in order to demonstrate the offensive, and the main forces of the battalion in the second half of the night through an unshot ravine to approach the positions of the fascists and suddenly attack them from the flank. True, the regiment commander Lieutenant Colonel Nadezhkin did not immediately agree with this decision of the commander. He feared that the meltwater in the gully would prevent the battalion in a short time and secretly go to the attack line. In addition, it seemed to him risky to leave a bare section of the battalion. In the case of an enemy counterattack, it would complicate the situation in the strip of the entire regiment. Finally, the regimental commander agreed, emphasizing that the success of the task will largely depend on the suddenness, from the boldness and initiative of the officers of the battalion. This was understood, and Captain Gallagher, he, preparing for such a maneuver, took all this into account, provided for all sorts of surprises during the battle, organized interaction between units, neighbors, and artillery. Deputy Battalion Commander on Political Part Senior Lieutenant Kiyasov and Battalion Parter Junior Lieutenant Novosokotsev held a party meeting, explained the order of the offensive. Speaking in the debate, Communist Denisov, Grichko, Naidenov assured the command that their platoons and squads will honorably perform the task and called on all communists by personal example to ensure the successful actions of the soldiers of the battalion. After the meeting, the communists held talks with soldiers in companies and platoons. Here at dawn, our artillery mortars, Katyusha, made a 10-minute fire attack on the enemy defences. The abandoned platoon began a demonstrative attack from the front. Hitlerites opened heavy fire on the platoon. Having made a detour maneuver at night along the gully, the battalion of Captain Gallagher hit the enemy from the flank. Partog of the battalion Junior Lieutenant Novosokoltsev rose to his full height. Marchminists and Komsomol members, forward, he shouted, and with a high swing of his automatic rifle, rushed to the enemy trenches. Behind him rose the soldiers of the battalion, soldiers of the platoon of Communist Senior Sergeant Denisov Ryabov, Grunko, Sklyaro, Grushev, were the first to break into the trench and killed many fascists. In another place, a group of fighters led by Communist Naidenov got into a hand-to-hand fight. The fascists could not withstand the blow of the Russian bayonet and rolled back. Half an hour later, the trenches were cleared of Hitlerites. On the shoulders of the retreating enemy, the battalion broke into the village Krasnosilka from the west, and from the south other battalions of the regiment rushed in. The fight for each house began. The fascists put up fierce resistance. The soldiers had to use grenades and bayonets. Suddenly, from the corner of one house, clanking tracks, turned out a tank. It went straight at the platoon commander, Senior Sergeant Denisov, who had already used up all the grenades. The senior sergeant was hitting the sight slits of the armoured vehicle with his automatic rifle. Bullets bounced off the armour. At this critical moment, Naidenov rushed to Denisov's aid. Having chosen a convenient moment, he threw an anti-tank grenade, and the tank with a broken caterpillar spun on the spot. When enemy tankers began to leave the car, Denisov destroyed them with a machine gun. The second car of the enemy was hit from the gun by Sergeant Mikov. The way to our soldiers was blocked by enemy machine gun fire from the attic of one of the houses. Soldier Omichenko stealthily crept up to the house and threw a grenade into the attic. The fascist machine gun was silenced. Hitlerites tried to return lost positions. From the neighbouring village, a battalion of Germans, supported by several tanks, rushed in a counterattack, but the artillerymen of Captain German Malshakov's division pressed the Nazis to the ground. Our tankers came to the aid of the rifle battalions. The counterattack was repulsed. Well acted in this battle sappers company Captain Logachev, the sappers Daminov, holder of the Order of Glory, Shapovalov, Baranov, Militvorensky, Mazura, under the guidance of the platoon commander Communist Nikiforov, for 2 hours cleared the passage for the regiment's advance, removed more than 500 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. The village Krasnosilka became free from the occupants. In this battle, the regiment took an enemy company prisoner. The captured officer showed that the Soviet soldiers appeared from the flank so suddenly that they did not have time to open an organized fire. Having forded the Dnieper, the troops of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts from the areas of Kiev and Kremenchug launched rapid offensive operations in the right bank Ukraine. Between the fronts, in the middle reaches of the Dnieper, on the right bank near Kanev, the Germans managed to hold on. The so-called Korsun-Shevchenkovsky bulge was formed. The fascists strived to keep this bulge at any cost. They created a stable defense here. All settlements, ravines and groves were adapted to defense. Hitlerites counted on holding the ledge to prevent the connection of the adjacent flanks of the Ukrainian fronts and prevent their advance to the southern bug, to choose the right moment and to strike at the flanks of the above-mentioned fronts to restore the lost positions on the right bank Ukraine. But the fascists miscalculated. The offensive of the strike groups of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, carrying out a maneuver to encircle the enemy troops on that bulge, was so rapid that the fascist command did not have time to concentrate forces to counteract the breakthrough areas. On January 24, the advanced battalions suddenly attacked the Nazis and broke through their defences. Following them, the main forces of the 4th Guards Army, which included our Ural Division, were brought into the battle. In the afternoon, the 5th Guards Tank Army of General Rotmistrov entered the battle, which successfully moved forward from the east and broke through the second strip of Nazi defences. Fierce battles unfolded along the entire front. The soldiers courageously repelled the enemy counterattacks that followed one after another. On January 28, the 1st Ukrainian front struck a counterstrike from the west and the tankers of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts met. Thus, the tank ring closed. In the area of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, a large group of fascists was surrounded. In an effort not to let Hitlerites come to their senses, the internal and external fronts were created simultaneously. Suddenly came Thaw, and Thaw complicated the movement of troops. Cars, people were bogged down in mud. 4 pairs of horses could barely pull one cannon. Sometimes even tanks got stuck. From January 27 to February 18, 10 days of rain and wet snow. It was especially difficult to overcome heights and ravines, of which there were a lot. The fascists resisted stubbornly, clinging to every line. Waging fierce battles, our 375th Ural Division with other compounds of the 4th Guards Army were tightening the ring of encirclement. In early February, the division came to the line Sklevatka, farms Venigorodsky, and took the defence, the front to the southwest, on the outer ring of encirclement, and was promptly subordinated to the 5th Tank Army. The first meeting with the commander of the Tank Army we had at his observation post. After the division commander and I introduced ourselves to him, the general inquired about the condition of the units and the combat affairs of the unit. Having listened to us, Pavel Alexandrovich Rotmistrov said, "I am glad for the successes of the division in the battles near Moscow and at the Kursk Bulge. I hope that it will also steadfastly and courageously fight the enemy in this area," and as if by the way he added, "Among my tankers too, there are Urals. I am satisfied with them. They are steadfast warriors." General P.A. Rotmistrov set a combat task for our division, to take the defence on the outer front of the encirclement of enemy troops and not to allow a breakthrough of the Nazis, rushing to their encircled to the rescue. The 5th Tank Army was defending from Zenogorka to Vodianoe. Barely our Ural Division had time to take the defence and entrench, as it was attacked by fascist tanks and infantry. Hot fights broke out. Hitlerites fought desperately, tried at any cost to break through our external defence front and join their encirclement. All attacks of the enemy were repulsed. The soldiers of the division, together with the tankers of the 5th Tank Division, shot up 11 tanks and destroyed a lot of enemy manpower. Heroically acted in this critical situation soldiers of our sapper battalion, Being on the front line of defense in the most dangerous directions, they installed several hundred anti-tank mines. Only on the mines set by the sapper department of Sergeant Eroshko, Private Sappers Polyakov, Alexeyev, Mamut, Masalyev, Rakim Tan, 3 fascist tanks were blown up. Officers of the political department agitator Major Pavel Kushnir, Assistant Chief of the Political Department for Komsomol Work Senior Lieutenant Pavel Bunakov, Agitator Major Nikolai Kotov, Instructor for Work Among the Enemy Troops Captain Isaac Rabinovich, being on the front line of defense in battalions, by their personal example inspired the soldiers to persevere. On this section of the external front, bloody battles were continuously fought during the first week of February. On February 8, the Soviet command, in order to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, gave the encircled troops an ultimatum to lay down their arms. The text of this ultimatum is given verbatim. Ultimatum. To the commander of the 42nd Army Corps, to the commander of the 11th Army Corps, commanders of the 112th, 88th, 167th, 82nd, 57th and 332nd Infantry Divisions, 213th Guard Division, SS Panzer Division Viking Motorized Brigades Wallonia, or officer personnel of the German troops surrounded in the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky area. 42nd and 11th Army Corps of the German Army are in complete encirclement. Red Army troops' iron ring encircled this grouping. The ring of encirclement is getting tighter and tighter. All your hopes for rescue are in vain. Some attempts to help you with ammunition and fuel by means of transport planes have failed. Only for 2 days, February 3 and 4, the ground and air forces of the Red Army shot down more than 100 U-52 planes. 2. As commanders and officers of the encircled units, understand perfectly well that there are no real possibilities to break the encirclement ring. Your situation is hopeless, and further resistance is pointless. It will only lead to huge casualties among German soldiers and officers. To avoid unnecessary bloodshed, we propose to accept the following terms of surrender. 1. All encircled German troops led by you, with your headquarters, immediately cease hostilities. 2. You hand over to us all personnel, weapons, all combat equipment, vehicles, and all equipment. We guarantee life and safety to all officers and soldiers who have ceased resistance, and after the end of the war, return to Germany or to any other country at the personal will of the prisoners of war. All personnel of surrendered units will be retained. Military uniforms, insignia and orders, personal property and valuables, and senior officers will, in addition, be retained their cold weapons. All wounded and sick will be provided with medical assistance. All surrendered officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers will be immediately fed. Your reply is expected by 11 a.m. on February 9, 1944, Moscow time, in writing through your personal representatives, who are to drive a car with a white flag on the road going from Korsun-Shevchenkovsky through Steblev to Kirovka. Your representative will be met by an authorized Russian officer near the eastern outskirts of Kirovka on February 9, 1944 at 11 o'clock Moscow time. If you reject our offer to lay down arms, the Red Army troops and the air fleet will begin actions to destroy your encircled troops, and you will be responsible for their destruction. Deputy Supreme Commander-in-Chief Marshal of the Soviet Union Zhizhukov. Commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, Army General N. Vachutin. Commander of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, Army General I. Korsun. The fascist generals rejected this humane proposal, and the fighting resumed with renewed vigor. Hitlerites with even greater forces and with greater fierceness began to rush to the attack. Tense fighting took place both on the outer and inner fronts of the encirclement. Schumer, in a telegram to General Stemmerman, wrote, "You can rely on me as a stone wall. You will be released from the cauldron, and while holding on to the last cartridge." Especially dangerous was the Hitlerites' counterattack in the direction of Shenderovka by the forces of 7 tank divisions. As a result of this counterattack, the enemy managed to squeeze our troops. The distance between the inner and outer fronts of the encirclement was reduced to 12 kilometers. On February 10, Army General I. Eskonev decided to withdraw the 5th Guards Tank Army from the outer front of the encirclement and our section in the corridor of the enemy breakthrough to the area of Lysyanka. So commander of the front set the task to the rifle troops to defend the occupied lines and not to allow the enemy tank group to break through the front. Despite the muddy field roads, Compounds of the 4th Guards Army during the day made a 40-kilometre march and timely occupied the defensive lines. Marshal I. Kanichste in his book Notes of the Front Commander 1943-1944. On page 117 he writes, "To occupy the defence along the river Hanai Tikich on February 12, troops of the 4th Guards Army, 41st Rifle Division, 7th Guards Airborne Division, 69th, 110th and 375th Rifle Divisions came to the section Oktyabr, Lysianka, Maidanivka, Zvenogorodka, which made it possible to reliably ensure the junction of the fronts from the breakthrough of the enemy's tank group to Lysianka from the area of Rubany Most. Day after day, the fighting became fiercer. Despite heavy losses, the enemy did not stop attacking, pulling up more and more fresh tank and motorized units, threw them into battle, trying with all their might to break through the outer ring of encirclement. Steady defense and decisive counterattacks division in its section every time threw the Nazis back. On February 13, having introduced fresh forces, the enemy again attacked our positions. The soldiers of the division and tankers repulsed 3 attacks, but immediately followed by a 4th, more powerful. This time the Nazi tanks managed to break through the defense of the 1,241st Infantry Regiment. A group of tanks with a landing party rushed straight to the observation post of the commander of the 1st Rifle Battalion, Lieutenant Urupin. The enemy tanks were fired on by the artillerymen, parateropsy and tanks from the spot. The paratroopers were met by machine gunners. In some places grenades and bayonets went into action. Sergeant Mikova's gun was attacked by 5 tanks. The unit engaged in an unequal battle and hit one of the machines. Soon an enemy shell exploded nearby and knocked out almost the whole unit. Left alone, the sergeant aimed the gun and made an accurate shot. Another tank froze in place. It was engulfed in flames. The next tank, increasing its speed, rushed at Mikova's gun and crushed it. Sergeant Mikov, the commander of the tank, was also killed. Senior Sergeant Mustafayev, the battalion's Partuka battalion, hit this tank with an anti-tank weapon. Machine gunner Popovich was firing long bursts at enemy machine gunners. A Hitler tanker noticed Popovich and directed his tank at him. Popovich did not chicken out. When the tank came almost close to the trench, the soldier threw a bunch of grenades. The explosion broke through the track of the fascist machine. The Hitler, having opened the hatch of the tank, seriously wounded Popovich with a pistol shot. Army man Berezhnoi was firing at the enemy with a machine gun. Suddenly he noticed that enemy tanks were coming out of the ravine. Not far from him was in his trench armoured gunner Petrov, who had several tanks on his account, for which he was awarded the Order of Glory. Tanks approached closer and closer, and Petrov did not fire. Berezhnoi got worried and rushed to the trench of his comrade. Petrov was badly wounded. Berezhnoi took Petrov's anti-tank gun and with a few shots tore the track of the enemy tank. Thrown by soldiers, Saneshko, Baiji and Mosukovi bottles with combustible mixture set fire to this tank. Hitlerites jumped out of the tank, but they were mowed down by the fire of our soldiers' automatic weapons. Machine gunner Miroshnichenko, a former frontline soldier, was not confused when the tank approached his trench. He put his machine gun in the trench, missed the tank and again opened fire on the enemy machine gunners advancing behind the tanks. His accurate cues and cut off the fascists from the tanks. Our artillerymen tank guardsmen met the enemy vehicles that had broken through with strong fire. A group of soldiers led by the deputy commander of the 1st Battalion, Lieutenant Kuprianov, engaged in hand-to-hand combat with infantry. The second group of soldiers who rushed into hand-to-hand combat was led by the battalion commander himself, Lieutenant Yuriapin. Most of the enemy infantry was destroyed. Our battalion also suffered heavy losses. 4 cannons, several machine guns were crushed by enemy tanks. Many soldiers died the death of the brave and were wounded. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Yuriapin, was seriously wounded. His deputy, Lieutenant Kupriyanov, was wounded. For about 3 hours there was a bloody battle. The battalion defended the occupied line and did not allow enemy tanks to help the surrounded Hitlerites. On February 15th, aspiring at any price to break through defence of 375th Rifle Division, the enemy again attacked our positions. Fighting flared up with new force and with each hour became stronger and hotter. After 2 fruitless attacks, having pulled up fresh forces, Hitlerites threw more tanks and infantry into the attack. Once again the battle heated up. In the second half of the day, at the cost of huge losses, the enemy tanks managed to cut into the defense of the division and go to the road Zvenogorodka, Yurkovka, occupy the grove and come close to the southern outskirts of Zvenogorodka. The situation became critical. Our divisions withdrew. After regrouping on the night of February 16, the division, supported by the 18th Tank Corps and its attached artillery, counterattacked the enemy and after a fierce battle by the end of the day restored the position. About that battle in the combat report of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, which was addressed to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, it was reported. The enemy, by repeated attacks of tanks, totaling 60 tanks, broke into the defense of the 375th Infantry Division. By counterattack of the 18th Tank Corps and artillery, the enemy was repulsed and the position at the front of the 375th Infantry Division was restored by the end of the day. The enemy lost only burned 15 tanks. Hitlerites' calculations to break through the defense front of the Ural 375th Infantry Division failed. The division courageously defended its positions, which ensured the liquidation of the encircled enemy at Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. It would be unfair not to mention the feats of the soldiers of the rear units. The petty officers of companies, batteries under the enemy fire organized delivery to the front line twice and sometimes 3 times a day of hot food for soldiers, replenished ammunition, chauffeurs of the motor company under bombardment and artillery fire on the roads, sometimes on virgin land brought mines, shells, grenades, ammunition to the front line day and night. Enemy bombers dive-bombed near the front line. In the village huts were burning. Smoke, like a fog, floated above the ground. Alexei Peroshkov drove the car. The terrain is open. Nikolai Petrov, a senior lieutenant sitting next to him, looked up and said, "These are our beauties." The senior lieutenant was admiring the squadron of silver Petyakovs. Maybe a fly. Falcons, fly. The air was trembling. Rapid shadows swept across the meadow. "There are 4 9s in the first echelon," counted Petrov, Cheer and Pyroshkov, and the car seemed to go faster. And behind the first squadron murmured the second. On the horizon loomed the third. At the bridge, the sappers on duty jumped out of the dugout, throwing up hats and shouting, "This is not the 41st for you fascists." From the hill, the battlefield opened up. Above it, the smoke streaks were rising higher and higher. The sun was getting blacker. The fire of divisions of the 932nd Artillery Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Efimovich Singer, was flaring up. His deputy on political part was Captain Mikhail Flegantovich Andrianov. Played Katyusha. From the red-hot arrows of the guards' mortars in the sky flowed wavy white-grey smoke. Pikirchiki dropped ladles of molten metal on the head of the attacking enemy. Bombs, shells, and mines were bursting in the ranks of fascist gunners. Alexei Kirillovich's car with ammunition, having overcome a difficult way, arrived to the 1245th Rifle Regiment. Ammunition was quickly distributed among battalions and companies. Major Mikhail Shubin, deputy commander of the division on the home front, personally controlled that the soldiers were fed and had enough ammunition. Divisional Dr. Major Vasily Zeludov, being on the front line, strictly checked that all the seriously wounded were taken out of the battlefield in time, and the lightly wounded were helped. The orderly of the 1241st Rifle Regiment, Kedra, on his shoulders from a distance of more than 2 kilometers on February 16, carried 3 seriously wounded, up to 10 lightly wounded help. Doctors, nurses, paramedics of battalion and regimental medical stations and 454th Medical Unit rendered aid to hundreds of wounded. In the evening of February 16, it was freezing. Then clouds came, the blizzard raged. Visibility sharply deteriorated. Surrounded group of the enemy, no longer counting on help from the outside, seized by despair, decided, using the poor visibility, on the night of February 17, under cover of darkness and blizzard columns without shots to go to break the encirclement ring. But the deadly fire of our artillery, Katyusha, and rapid maneuver of tanks with lighted headlights destroyed the Hitlerites' plan, not giving them the opportunity to get out of the cauldron. Fascists who survived in this meat grinder, throwing their weapons, raising their hands and waving our leaflets, began to surrender in hundreds. By morning the firing stopped. The storm had stopped, replaced by frosty windlessness. The dawn opened the panorama of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky battle. Snow-covered fields and roads were cluttered with broken and abandoned equipment of the enemy, blasted tanks, armoured personnel carriers, vehicles, guns, tractors, Nazi corpses. All this was a picture of the great defeat of the enemy, one of the largest operations of the Second World War in terms of its results. So by the end of February 17, 1944, the German grouping in the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky cauldron ceased to exist. In the history of the Great Patriotic War, this battle entered as the Second Stalingrad. Sovinformbureau reported on February 17. The troops of the Second Ukrainian Front, as a result of fierce fighting that continued uninterruptedly for 14 days, on February 17 completed the operation to destroy 10 divisions and 1 brigade of the Germans encircled in the area of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky. During this most difficult operation, the soldiers of the Ural 375th Kharkov Division, infantrymen, artillerymen, mortarmen, sappers, communicators, medics, economists, chauffeurs showed themselves to be steadfast, brave, devoted sons of the motherland, purposeful party political work carried out in units and subdivisions during the preparatory period and during the battles by commanders, political workers, party and Komsomol organizations contributed greatly to the victorious outcome of the battles. Our division during the battles hit and burned 25 tanks and captured 134 guns, destroyed a lot of enemy manpower. However, we also suffered great losses. Dozens of soldiers died on the battlefield and hundreds of soldiers, sergeants, officers were wounded, including our division commander Major General Pyotr Dmitrievich Govoronenko. On February 18, the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief Stalin was announced, which stated that during the fierce fighting to defeat the encircled enemy grouping, the soldiers, officers and generals showed examples of courage, heroism, bravery and ability to beat the enemy. All the personnel was announced gratitude, including, of course, and the soldiers of the 375th Kharkov Rifle Division. I note that this was the 7th in the course of the war, thanks to Mr. Stalin, to the soldiers of our division. In the evening, Moscow, in commemoration of the victory, saluted with 20 artillery salvos from 224 guns. Many soldiers of the division were awarded orders and medals. Just a few lines took a description of the unforgettable combat actions of the division in this great battle. But there is no measure to measure the courage and bravery of the soldiers of the division. We were young then. All our youth was spent in the fire, and we'll never forget about Korsun and the war. In connection with the wounding of the division commander General Govoronenko in January and until February 24, 10-15 days, his duties were performed by the Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel Konstantin Mikhailovich Loshko, Colonel Nikita Efimovich Tsygankov, sent from the Army Commander of the 1,241st Rifle Regiment, Major General Akim Vasilievich Yakshin. February 24 took the division newly appointed Division Commander Major General Vasily Dmitrievich Karpyukin, a former employee of the General Staff and recently Chief of Staff of the 53rd Army. Vasily Dmitrievich, looking ahead, I will say, was a focused and restrained general, kind, fair and demanding commander. He did not swear, did not make noise, did not pull his subordinates. There was no case that he was in a hurry to punish someone. He commanded the division until the end of the war. I was always grateful to him. After the defeat of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky grouping of Germans 375th Ural, Kharkov Rifle Division was transferred from the 5th Guards Tank Army again to the 53rd Army. So ended bright days for us. Again began a difficult time. From the memoirs of the Deputy Commander of the 932nd Artillery Regiment, on political part, Captain M. F. Andrianov. Many years have passed after the Battle of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, but those battles are still in my memory. Near Korsunia we took the ferocious enemy, who until the last moment did not want to resign himself to his fate and, despite the losses, desperately rushed out of the cauldron. At that time I was Deputy Commander of the 932nd Artillery Regiment in political affairs. The fork of the road near Zvenigorodka was always remembered. Our gun batteries were put forward 4 kilometers ahead of the infantry. This is in case of a breakthrough of enemy tanks. And so it happened. A column of fascist machines moved to the batteries along the highway. Hitlerites decided to break through by all means. We swore to withstand, not to let the enemy through. The battle was hot. Many of our artillerymen fell to the death of the brave, but the enemy did not pass. By the way, about this and many other events of those days, I wrote to the Museum of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky battle. Museum workers sent me a questionnaire which I filled out and returned back. I often remember and compare the battles near Moscow, on the Kursk Bulge and in the area of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, how inexpressibly difficult it was for us in the 41st and 42nd, and with what skill, with what faith in victory we beat the Nazis in the 44th. From the memoirs of the Chief of Artillery Supply of the 244th Separate Fighter Anti-Tank Division, Colonel G.A. Aristakesian. The Battle of Korsun-Shevchenkovo was especially memorable for me. First, because on the eve of the battle Sergei Kukusanovich Anutinov handed me a party ticket. Now I hear his words of advice. Don't forget, a communist is always on the lookout. Hundreds of eyes are looking at you, as if asking what your personal contribution to our common cause is. And he, our chief of political department, himself was in full view of the fighters and commanders. Well, and secondly, after the end of the battle, on February 18, 1944, I was transferred from the 1241st Rifle Regiment to the 244th Separate Fighter Anti-Tank Division to the post of Chief of Artillery Supply. Did we dream to live to the 84th, which then, in 1944, seemed unimaginably far away? Well, thank fate for the fact that after 4 years of war we have many years of peace, and youth and maturity and love and fatherhood. But today is the 40th anniversary of the glorious victory at Korsun-Shevchenko, and so my thoughts are there now. Our 375th Ural Rifle Division was attached to the 5th Guards Tank Army of General Rotmistrov. Parts of the division participated in the breakthrough of enemy defences and the creation of an external front of encirclement southeast of Zemigorodka, and I was then head of artillery workshops in the 1241st Rifle Regiment. In the morning of February 12, the enemy attacked our positions, throwing into battle more than 60 tanks. The enemy managed on one of the sections of the neighbouring 1243rd Rifle to squeeze our fighting order, but by counterattack he was thrown back to the former lines. Only in this battle 15 fascist tanks were hit and burned. Remember what high courage showed the fighters of Lieutenant Uryupin's battalion. They managed to cut off the enemy infantry from the tanks and then destroyed them in hand-to-hand combat. It was talked about in all units, and about machine gunner Miroshnichenko too, when one of the enemy tanks approached the trench. Miroshnichenko missed the tank and then opened deadly fire on the Nazis who were advancing behind the tank. In the battle near Zvenygorodka, the sniper of our regiment, Private Alboshi, distinguished himself. Being in an ambush behind our front line, he noticed how a passenger car came out of the settlement occupied by the enemy. The car was already turning onto a dirt highway when a shell exploded near it. Alboshki killed the Hitlerite who jumped out of it with the first shot. After liberation of the settlement, it was found out that the driver was killed by shell splinters. In 15 meters, Hitler's general was lying with a pierced chest. And I remember the last battle near Korsun-Shevchenko as if it was yesterday. In the evening, a snowstorm began. Ferocious wind was cracking straw stacks, tearing the roofs of village huts. Above the front line, a cloudy shroud of snow was raging, behind which nothing could be seen. It was long past dusk when, with a large column of ammunition on a sled together with the head of the artillery supply of the regiment Nikonov, we arrived at the command post. Regimental Commander Paramoshin, with eyes reddened from sleeplessness, gave orders into the telephone receiver. When he finished talking, we reported on the delivery of ammunition and noticed a kind smile on his lips. Well done, just in time. Intelligence data confirm that this night Hitlerites intend to make a decisive attempt to break out of the encirclement, immediately distribute ammunition to units, check materiel and be on guard. We finished the ammunition distribution deep in the night. And one more frame in my memory. In one of the units, leaning against the frozen wall of the trench, pulling on ear flaps, artillerymen were sitting and looking up. A signal rocket was to appear. At that time, many soldiers arrived to us, who after the liberation of their villages voluntarily joined the army, without waiting for the military enlistment officers to start working. I paid attention to 2 soldiers artillerymen, who carefully inspected each box of shells delivered to them, and carefully stacked them in the recesses of the firing position. Both acted intelligently, and with great diligence. I learned that they were father and son. They were in the same gun crew. Well fought. Praised them, battery commander. What a pity that I had forgotten the names of these soldiers. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning when a chain of rockets flew over the front line, breaking through the swirling cloud of the snowstorm. It turns out that the enemy, taking advantage of bad weather, Dense columns moved from the Shenderovka area to the positions of our troops of the inner front of the encirclement. At the signal, our Katyushas and artillery opened fire. And the rapid maneuver of tanks with lighted headlights finally mixed up the Hitlerites' battle orders. Their columns turned into helpless accumulation of exhausted, morally crushed people. Throwing their weapons, raising their hands, waving our leaflets, they began to surrender in hundreds. By morning the firing had ceased. The blizzard was replaced by a frosty windlessness. Snow-covered fields and roads were cluttered with broken and abandoned any equipment. On the roads leading to Zenigorodka, grey-green river flowed columns of prisoners. And on the next day, it was surely remembered by all comrades in arms. On February 18, 1944, we were read the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, which said that during the fierce fighting to defeat the encircled enemy grouping, soldiers, officers and generals showed examples of courage, heroism, bravery and the ability to beat the enemy. All the personnel was announced gratitude. I write and think, you and I had a chance to participate in unforgettable events. As a result of Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation, the troops of the two Ukrainian fronts not only surrounded and destroyed a large group of the enemy, but also defeated another 15 fascist divisions, including 8 tank divisions. Heavy losses weakened Hitlerites' forces. Favorable conditions were created for the Soviet army to continue the offensive, although the enemy was still clinging tenaciously to every frontier, every settlement of the right bank Ukraine. The Soviet command took all measures not to give the enemy a respite. The troops, despite the spring thaw, launched offensive operations. On March 8, the division received a combat order, ready to go on the offensive with the task to knock the enemy out of the occupied line and seize the settlement of Vodyanoye to pursue the retreating enemy. On the night of March 8, the Divisional Reconnaissance Company, commanded by Captain Miroshnichenko, conducted a battle reconnaissance of the front edge of the enemy defense. In the course of the battle, the front edge was clarified, fire points were the company captured an Oberefriman, who told that in front of the village created a continuous line of trenches, connected by passages of communication with the second. In front of the trenches, minefields. In the houses were made embrasures, in which machine guns are installed. This is such a fortified line had to break through and take possession of Vodyane. Many episodes, which I witnessed, were a confirmation of how difficult it was for units to solve the combat. To ensure a breakthrough in the main direction of the strike, created a large density of artillery. Each battery was tasked to act in the interests of the rifle units. Artillerymen well understood that the success of the battle depends on the organization of close and flexible cooperation in all links of the combat chain. Accurate fire of guns merging with the fire and blows of infantry and tanks can ram the enemy defense. Exactly at the appointed hour, our artillery dropped its fire on the front edge of the enemy defences. Supines miners under the leadership of the commander of the Sapper Battalion, Major Dmitry Andrianovich Klopov, and his deputy on political part, Major Abraman Bayanovich, under cover of artillery fire, began to demine the enemy field to make passages for riflemen and tanks. The infantry came close to the front line to rush into the enemy trenches, and rockets soared into the sky. Attack! Attack! All along the front line there was hurrah, hurrah, as if thousands of soldiers came out of the ground and moved forward rapidly, hurrying behind the firing shaft of their artillery. It was the soldiers of the 1243rd Rifle Regiment of Major Vladimir Ivanovich Borisov and the soldiers of the 1245th Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Ivanovich Nadezhkin who rushed forward. As always, in the front ranks of the attackers were political workers, communists and Komsomol members. Thus, with the 1st Battalion of the 1243rd Rifle Regiment went, enthralling by personal example in the fighting order of the deputy commander of the regiment on the political part of Lieutenant Colonel Mukamed Akhtamyanovich Akhmetsyano. In the 1st Battalion of the 1245th Rifle Regiment, deputy commander of the regiment, on the political part of Major Peter Petrovich Gritsenko. In the 2nd Battalion of this regiment, agitator of the political department of the division, Major Nikolai Alexeyevich Kotov. After a hard fight, the regiments of the division captured the 1st and 2nd trenches, broke into Vodyanoy and Kayuovka. The fascists fiercely snapped back. Automatic rifles and machine guns were crackling. 6-barrel mortars were howling like donkeys. Enemy cannons were beating. Several times Hitlerites counterattacked with tanks. but they were met by our artillerymen and infantrymen with all means of fire. During the reflection of the enemy counterattack, the soldiers of the battery of the 932nd Artillery Regiment of Captain Remezov especially distinguished themselves. The calculation of Senior Sergeant Ivan Neveny shot down 2 tanks. The commander of the 1st Platoon of the 2nd Rifle Company of the 1243rd Rifle Regiment I. Remenyuk showed high initiative and tactical skill, who with his platoon struck a blow from the flank at the counter-attacking Hitlerites. Red Army men of the platoon N.D. Kozlov, A.H. Tachenko, N.W. Renko killed many fascists in hand-to-hand combat. Battery of 45mm guns, Lieutenant Khrushchev shot down a tank. Gun of Senior Sergeant Reshetnikov destroyed many enemy machine gunners with shrapnel. Nothing could no longer stop the avalanche in the military brotherhood of the advancing regiments. Within 2 days, having released Vodyanoye, Kaurovka regiments of the division advanced deep into the enemy defense for 12 kilometers. Let it be in the past, but we are soldiers. We can't forget the trench life. And even those who have been in the trenches will support my statement that the brotherhood of soldiers is unbreakable. As long as we shall live, we'll be an unstoppable force to keep the world from destruction. Having lost the defensive line and a large amount of manpower and equipment, the enemy, like a wounded beast, began to crawl away to his lair, leaving bloody traces on his way. When we entered the village of Karnovka, a terrible picture of blatant Nazi atrocities appeared before us. A day before our arrival, Hitlerites stole all population, all cattle, took away all valuable property. Those who refused to leave with them were shot, houses were burnt, the remaining cattle were killed in the yards. The enemy sought to break away from the pursuit to go to a new frontier and delay our advance. The division commander, remembering Suvorov's words that 1 minute decides the outcome of battles, 1 hour, the success of campaigns, 1 day, the fate of the country, ordered the regiments not to give the enemy an opportunity to gain a foothold on favorable lines, to pursue the retreating enemy, to outrun him, to force him to abandon his equipment, not to let him take out equipment and wealth of Ukraine. Spring has begun. The fields were freed from snow, the ground thawed, the rivers overflowed. The rains that began in the first days of March worsened the condition of dirt roads, where there was impenetrable mud, vehicles stuck and slipped, horses and people got stuck in the mud. In places of ascents and descents it was impossible to do without towing or without the help of soldiers pushing vehicles. And the fascists had high hopes for bad weather conditions, assuming that they would get a respite. However, the high morale of soldiers, Bogatar's strength and offensive impulse allowed to realize what seemed impossible. With unrelenting vigor, the division units successfully overcame these difficulties and broke through the strong defensive lines of the enemy. On March 1944, the newspaper Pravda wrote, "What the highest heat should be the offensive impulse to go daily, in any weather, day and night, without rest, fighting through the mud, to pursue the enemy when he runs, to break his defenses when he resists, and to drive him away. To drive away from our land to the Bug, over the Dniester, to the end. For such an offensive impulse, inspiration and enthusiasm alone are not enough. We must have the Bolshevik will. We must have the strength of a Bogatyr." On March 13, the division reached the Bolshaya and Vis rivers. The bridges were blown up. There was nothing to count on the ford, as the rapid melting of snow made the river full-flowing and wide. The sappers were tasked to restore the bridge to cross the artillery and combat supplies, and the infantry to cross on boats and rafts. In 6 hours, the division crossed the river, pursuing the retreating enemy, knocking down his small groups. The division went forward. When the horses were exhausted, soldiers came to the wagons, guns, and helped to pull heavily loaded wagons and guns. The soldiers did not ask why it was necessary to hurry, why not to wait for good days, but to advance through the mud, for they knew that every minute one saved someone's life, deprived the enemy of the opportunity to set fire and destroy someone's house. The division, having covered a 50-kilometer distance, came to the Sinuka River, which overflowed up to 300 meters. Bridges were blown up, and there was no hope for their quick restoration. Rifle and sapper units began to find improvised means to build ferries. Sapper Battalion Commander Major Klopov and his deputy for political part Major Bayan around-the-clock built rafts. All this work personally supervised Divisional Engineer Lieutenant Colonel Yablokov, Having crossed, the division continued to pursue the enemy through the mud and with fights, overcoming the difficulties of the way and resistance of the fascists, went forward, clearing the villages and hamlets of Ukraine from the German filth. From March 8 to March 21, the division passed with battles more than 250 kilometers, overcoming many water obstacles and breaking the defensive lines of the Germans. These battles raised the mood of the personnel even more. Because this tiresome march was victorious, everyone knew that one more effort, and the motherland will be completely cleared of invaders. Hitlerites decided to delay at the intermediate line, where trenches were dug in advance. By dawn of March 21 regiments of the division with a fight broke into the southeastern outskirts of the village Pesino, which from north to south Blue Vein cut the river Savranka. The western outskirts of the village was at the foot of the mountain. Here the enemy decided to delay our offensive in order to withdraw in an organized manner and take the looted riches of Ukraine to Germany. The blow to the fascists was struck so suddenly that they did not have time to realize their already prepared black deed to destroy the inhabitants of the village. The fierce fight began. Hitlerites began to bomb our fighting orders continuously. 30-40 airplanes U-87 made raids and threw their bombs on the division and on the houses of the eastern part of the village. A group of brave men of the 1245th Rifle Regiment, led by the Pater of the 1st Rifle Battalion, Lieutenant Semyon Ivanovich Lutsenko, stealthily bypassed the village of Pesino. When you look at Semyon Ivanovich, he does not look belligerent at all. Bluish shadows under the color of his eyes, from insomnia. Wrinkles have escaped from the bridge of his nose and, having played out, moved down to his cheeks. Maybe that made his face simple and smiling. Now he didn't look like himself at all. He was determined, focused, and there was not a shadow of a smile on his face. The group, having crossed Savranka to the western bank, attacked the Nazis from the western part of the village. The group arrived in time. The huts were burning hotly. Fascist flamethrowers ran around the village and set fire to the houses. About 60 old men, women and children of Pesino were languishing in the gully under the muzzles of German automatic rifles, waiting to be shot. The group caught the bandits at the scene of the crime. They did not have time to do their black deed. They were overtaken by machine gun bursts of our soldiers. The fighters saw the torchbearer set fire to the barn. The roof was covered with fire, but a machine gun burst killed the arsonist. When the soldiers opened the barn, more than 20 people, doomed to be burned, rushed towards them. The horror of the experience had not yet disappeared, but their eyes were already shining with joy. An old woman shouted at Semyon Ivanovich, "My relatives, come on. The hut is on fire. The children are there, my grandchildren." "Where?" See, the battle was still going on. Semyon Ivanovich turned to the burning hut. He ran across the street. The reed roof was throwing fire. The door was on fire. You couldn't go near it. Smoke was pouring out of the windows. Lutsenko broke the window with the butt of his automatic rifle and got into the house. Under the bench, a girl and a little boy. Only black eyes are visible. Taking them an armful through the window, he went out into the yard. With difficulty, Semyon unclenched their hands that clung to his neck. Passing the children one by one to the villagers, he said, "The little ones will live, goodbye." And knocking down the flames that engulfed his uniform, he rushed further down the street, to the place where the group was finishing the arsonists. By this time, having forced Savranka, the 1245th Rifle Regiment began to clear the village of fascists. Few brigands managed to escape from retribution. That day more than 20 fascists were taken prisoner. These were selected Hitler's bandits, thugs from the division SS Dead Head. But once captured, they tried to pretend to be innocent lambs, babbled Hitler Kot, Hitler kaput, became meek, and wanted to justify themselves by the fact that they were forced to kill. I especially remember the following picture. In another village we liberated, in a vegetable garden, the fascists raped and killed a girl who looked to be about 11 or 12 years old. Apparently, she was on her way to school. She was lying in the crumpled grass, and student notebooks and textbooks covered with blood were lying around. Her face was horribly chopped, and she was clutching an open bag in her hand. We covered her body with a cloak tent and went to beat the hated enemy. The bloody trail, atrocities of fascists, we met along the whole way of the division in the liberated towns and villages of the country and in European countries. Therefore now, remembering these terrible atrocities of the fascists, One cannot read in the press without indignation how after the war the executioners, murderers who killed millions of innocent, defenseless Soviet people, citizens of European countries, freely walk around in West Germany and in some other countries, occupy high positions. The current German authorities openly favor those whose past is stained with the blood of innocent people. According to the German legislation existing today, former Nazi criminals, also officers of the SS units, in addition to the usual pension, receive an allowance as victims of war. Thus, the officer Heinz Barter, a participant of mass murders, having been sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity by the GDR tribunal after the reunification of Germany, regularly began to receive an additional supplement to his pension as a victim of war. Since Latvia's independence, former Nazis have been receiving pensions and supplements. According to the German weekly Die Zeit, more than 50,000 people currently enjoy the right to receive such pension supplements. However, it is known that under a law passed in 1950, former concentration camp inmates do not receive preferential pensions as victims of the fascist regime if they were members of the Communist Party after German reunification. Former GDR security officers were deprived of their entitlements. Recently, unofficial links between the Bundeswehr and neo-fascist, revanchist organizations of SS veterans have been revealed. Thus, the Comrade Steiner Corporation, which unites former SS volunteers and soldiers, as well as young admirers of SS General Felix Steiner, received several army vehicles under the guise of humanitarian aid from the Ministry of Defense. There is a request for construction equipment, uniforms, tools, and medical supplies. This is how Germany generously distributes bonuses, humanitarian aid to former Nazis guilty of the deaths of innocent Soviet people. Obviously, Germany does not want to take effective measures against former Nazis and the neo-fascist forces and their extremist organizations that emerged after the war for some reason. Unless more effective measures are taken at the state level to curb the activities of neo-fascists, we can expect an increase in neo-Nazi activity, including in the Bundeswehr. Why is there so much tolerance and encouragement for murderers? The question still remains unanswered. It seems to me that Germany has begun to slip back into Nazism. Pesino was cleared of the occupants, but the enemy fortified itself on the heights west of the village and began to resist stubbornly. The division commander General Karpukain ordered the 1241st Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ignatiy Igorovich Kosogorov, and his deputy in the political part was Major Nikolai Konstantinovich Urbanovich, to bypass the heights on the right and flank strike to knock out the enemy from them. The Germans strengthened the heights, saturating them with a large number of machine guns and mortars. All night, the scouts of the regiment and battalion commanders conducted relentless observation of the positions of the Germans. By the flashes of machine guns and mortars, from which the Nazis continuously fired on the positions of our units, determined their location at altitude, found the joints between the strongholds of the enemy defense. The regiment commander clarified the discovered joints, calculated everything, and at dusk decided to boldly strike 2 battalions on the flank of the enemy. The stealth of approaching the enemy ensured surprise. Hitlerites, not expecting a flank attack, dropped their weapons and rolled back. The soldiers picked up 10 serviceable machine guns and 5 mortars. Having seized the height, the regiment wedged into the enemy defense. Now the regiment had enemies on both flanks. It was not yet dawn. Knowing from experience that the Germans are unlikely to launch a counterattack before morning, the regiment commander, not fearing for their open flanks, leaving a small cover on the flanks, when taking advantage of the success of the 1241st Rifle Regiment, the division commander attacked the enemy with his main forces, knocked him completely off the heights, and the division units began to pursue the enemy. At one boundary, the Germans offered stubborn resistance, did not want to leave their positions. It was necessary to shoot them down. A star-like rocket soared into the blue sky. The signal attack. Seeing it, Senior Sergeant Nikifor Diego jumped up and ran forward shouting, "Hurrah! Hooray!" Ivan Petrov ran next to him with a carbine, followed by other soldiers. This attack was not the first for the senior sergeant, but for some reason today Diego wanted to fall down to bury himself in the ground, and by force of will, overcoming fear, he went forward. Private Petrov, who was running ahead of him, suddenly sat down, and there was no time to approach him. It was necessary to run to the enemy trench. Nikifor Ivanovich did not think about the fact that he could be wounded or killed now, and he would look at this field, at the blue sky. He thought only about one thing: to run, jump into the trench of the enemy and mercilessly beat the fascists. And he ran. When the battle subsided, the platoon commander Dnieper decided to look for Petrov. He was lying motionless on the open field. When Dnieper approached him, Petrov, as if waking up, opened his dry, cracked lips. "Have you got him?" "I didn't make it," he said quietly. "They took them. All who resisted destroyed." "In my pocket is my party ticket," whispered Petrov. "Give it to the party leader." "Lie still, now the orderly will come." Said the senior sergeant. "You will take you to the medical center. You will recover." Suddenly Petrov's eyes opened wide, as if he wanted to look at the sky. At the senior sergeant he sighed and collapsed. Pumpkinvut's trembling fingers unbuttoned the pocket of the gymnast skeleton, pulled out a party ticket drenched in blood and Tarty card. Surname Petrov. First name Ivan. Patronymic Vasilievich. Year of birth 1918. Time of joining the party October 1943. Name of the party organization that issued the ticket: Political Department of the 375th Kharkov Rifle Division. Signature: Date of issue October 10, 1943. Senior Sergeant thought a little, and after all, he received a party ticket from us during the fighting on the Dnieper bridgehead. Thus, at the cost of life and blood of many soldiers of the Ural 375th Infantry Division, a small piece of Ukrainian land was liberated from fascist invaders. The dead were buried in a mass grave, and fellow soldiers stood silent, went to avenge the lives of their battle friends. For this battle, some soldiers, including Petrov, were awarded. Senior Sergeant Nikifor Ivanovich Dnieper received the Order of Glory of the II degree. Looking ahead, I will say that till the end of the war, Senior Sergeant Dnieper participated in many more attacks, repeatedly courageously repulsed enemy counterattacks, for which he was awarded the Order of Glory of I and I degrees. After the war in 1945, as a holder of the Order of Glory of 3 degrees, from the division participated in the Victory Parade in Moscow. After demobilization, he returned to his village Verkhovina, to Klimsky district. The war ended. Years have passed, but Senior Lieutenant Semyon Ivanovich Lutsenko has not forgotten 2 little lumps, 2 human lives snatched by him from death. Lutsenko from Sverdlovsk wrote a letter to Pesino, Baut district, Odessa region. On March 21, 1944, our division liberated your village. From the burning house, the soldiers took out 2 boys. I don't know neither surnames nor names of the little ones. Write me if they are alive. The answer came quickly. The letter informed that the rescued girl is Lyubov Markovna Lokachuk, the foremost milkmaid of the collective farm named after Lenin. For 2 years she holds the red banner, an honored person. The boy, her brother Peter, also works in the collective farm. So the connection between Peshkani and Sverdlovsk was established. On May 5, 1965, former soldiers of the 375th Urals, Kharkov-Bucharest Twice Red Banner Rifle Division gathered together in the large hall of the Sverdlovsk District House of Officers of the Ural Military District. They gathered to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the victory and to remember the combat path of the division. Before the start of the gala evening in the foyer, smiles, tears. You've become curly. Your hair used to be thick and black. Now it is sprinkled with snow. And they're both laughing. These 2 frontline soldiers who passed in the ranks of the division, Colonel Nikolai Alexandrovich Polygalov, former deputy commander of the division on the rear, and Major Pavel Georgievich Zolotukin, former commander of the company of machine gunners. It is true, the years whiten our heads, but the heart remains in the line, does not go into the reserve, smiles Colonel Polygalov, a member of the Presidium of the Council of Veterans of the division. And here is another group of fellow soldiers: Glafira Prokopievna Lapina from Petropavlovsk, Anastasia Pavlovna Pevushina and Reza Pavlovna Grave from Sverdlovsk, Nikolai Nikolaevich Trutnev from Kurgan. Oh, girls, you haven't changed at all, just a little bit older. Yes, only by 20 years and 4 years. Yes, the soldiers of the war remain heroes on the labor front. All of them feel involved in the multifaceted life of the people. Many of them work. Even those veterans who are already on a well-deserved vacation Strive to be useful to society. Speak to young people, school children, soldiers in military units. Participate in trips to places of military glory of the division. Read lectures. Give talks on heroic and patriotic themes. Lessons of courage. Theme evenings. They work in the regional city. Divisional councils of war veterans. Ruby star burns above the white of grey hair hole. Fathers, mothers, grandfathers of soldiers of the Ural Native Division and guests, soldiers of garrison units, leaders of party Soviet bodies of the city. Region, military district came to the evening dedicated to the 20th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany. The friends of our fellow soldiers in the hall, faithful sons and daughters of Russia, our pride, our glory, our orders, medals, and a commemorative badge veteran of 375 Dusty, made of burgundy stone with dark veins. A Ural gemstone on the initiative of the Council of Veterans of the Division, burn on the chests of veterans of the Division. The banner, scorched by the fire of battles, under which the soldiers of the Division fought, is flying above the rows of veterans. The banner was brought by Major of the Reserve Pavel Zolotokin, assistants. Senior Lieutenant of the Reserve Mefody Ivanovich Antonyuk, Senior Sergeant of the Reserve Nikolai Georgievich Sizov. People in the hall, the banner met standing, Atl Orchestra. On the stage of the House of Officers in the Guard of Honor at the banner froze, replacing each other, grey-haired veterans of the division. The evening opens. Before the beginning of solemn speeches and reminiscences, the girl, who was rescued by the soldiers of the division on March 21, 1944 from the burning house, now a famous milkmaid of the Ukrainian collective farm named after Lenin Lyubov Markovna Lukichuk, who brought her liberators a lush Ukrainian loaf decorated with wonderful vignettes and flowers, baked by Ukrainian peasant women of the village of Pesino, rises on the stage. From the bottom of her heart with a bow, she passes the loaf, a sign of warm love and sincere gratitude to the former head of the political department of the Division S. Anot Dinov. A replica of this loaf is still exhibited in the Sverdlovsk Regional Museum of Local Law, in the department, which reflects the exploits of soldiers of the Ural 375th Infantry Division. When you think about this memorable meeting, about tears and smiles of veterans, about their friendly embrace, about Ukrainian caravay and Ural gems, it becomes warm and joyful. The enduring glory of the frontline heroes shines like a sun that does not. You involuntarily recall the front friendship. It is impossible to fit into the usual ideas about human ties. It has no boundaries and limits. If you have been in at least one battle with a man, you can't find him any truer. He will never tell you about loyalty, about friendship, will not call you an affectionate name, but he will silently give you the last pinch of tobacco, cover you in the trench with his overcoat, silently share the last piece of bread. He is ready to sacrifice his life for you, with all his heart to endure your longing and grief. He will never flood with tears when he sees your wound, but only tightly bandage it, take you on his shoulders and pull you out of the battle. He will never forgive you for your laziness, cowardice, or lies. This friendship continues even now, after the war. My comrades in arms, my grey-haired soldiers. Each of them has more than half a century behind him, and hard ways of life. Each has a stately gait, and an important slowness in their words, only a faded old cap, reminiscent of the war years. As we meet at our set tables, with glasses of wine clinking, we'll talk of our youth with kind words. We'll remember it many times, boys and girls, and those who have fallen, but are always with us, as in the days of war, in the terrible hour of attack, who stood up to enemy shells, to shield us from death. We will not forget. The name of the fallen is sacred. A toast in memory of those who died young. And here we are together like in 45, filled with the breath of the living. On the eve of the October holiday in 1965, I contacted by phone with the Odessa region, with the village of Pesino, from where the loaf was brought. Comrade Gola, the chairman of the board of a Lenin collective farm, came to the telephone. Here are fragments of this conversation, printed on the page of the newspaper Red Fighter for November 6, 1965. Hello, Andrei Tikhonovich, veterans of the 375th Ural Division, who participated in the liberation of your village from Nazi invaders, heartily congratulate you and all the workers of the collective farm named after Lenin on the 48th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. They wish you all good health and success in your labor. Together with you, we have recently received with joy and pride the news of awarding the main city of your region, valiant and glorious Odessa, the Order of Lenin and the Medal Gold Star. Thank you, thank you. Please pass on sincere congratulations to our unforgettable liberators. We always remember you, comrades of the Urals, with deep gratitude. How does Lyubov Markovna Lokachuk live? Well, she still holds the title of the best milkmaid firmly. Semyon Ivanovich Lutsenko thanks his goddaughter for the kind letter. He asked to congratulate her in a special way. I won't forget such congratulations, for our Lyuba Semyon Ivanovich is like a native father. What about our gift loaf? We gave it to the Urals Museum of Military Glory. Now more and more Sverdlovsk citizens will know about our friendship. And we honor your gifts. The best collective farmers were given commemorative signs made of Ural semi-precious stones. We read and reread the book about the heroic deeds of the division's heroes, and the children do not let Lyubov Markovna pass. Tell me, Aunt Lyuba, what Sverdlovsk is like, what the Urals are like. Show again the photos of those who liberated us. Thank you very much for your kind memory. And the last question, what was this production year like? After the March plenum of the Central Committee of the CPSU, things went steeply uphill. All planned indicators were successfully fulfilled. We fulfilled the annual target for milk by October 1, for sunflower 2. The funds became richer. Now we can think about the fact that our rural life did not differ from the city in culture and improvement. Now perhaps you do not recognize your village. That's true, but we will help you understand everything. Just come. You must come. We're looking forward to it. Thank you for the invitation. See you, Andrei Tikhonovich. Greetings to everyone. Such a conversation took place on the phone with the collective farm. A raid on the enemy's rear. Knocked down from the defensive line on the Sevrenka River, the enemy withdrew to a new prepared line of defense near the town of Belta. The 375th Division received a new order to go to the rear of the enemy and cut the railroad line near the town of Kotovsk. On March 25, 1241 and 1243 rifle regiments, where there was no solid defense of the Nazis, in the area of Lesnitshevka village went to their rear. As soon as the regiments crossed the highway, enemy armored personnel carriers from the Balta area along the highway struck and cut the ways of approach to them. The 1245th Rifle Regiment at this time was fighting in the forest northeast of the town of Balta. The division command faced a difficult task. In order to carry out a deep raid into the rear of the enemy regiments and to fulfill the intended purpose, personal leadership was necessary, and the path of the 1241st and 1243rd Infantry Regiments was cut by the Germans. Then the division commander decided that he, General Karpukin, the head of the political department Colonel Enatinov, the commander of the artillery division Lieutenant Colonel Azarov, with a group of daredevil scouts should get through the ring of Germans to the regiments that went to the rear of the enemy. We're crawling under heavy machine gun and mortar fire, and we're knocking down patrols of Germans. In 2 days, the division command joined the regiments operating behind enemy lines. Intelligence reported that in the village of Kamzovka is a large group of Germans. The village is not guarded. On the night of March 27, 1241st and 1243rd Rifle Regiments attacked the village of Kenzovka, where the Germans camped for the night, taking with them women and girls and not suspecting the close location of the Russian army, as the village was 45-50 kilometers from the front line, sleeping peacefully. They had no guards. Captured sleeping, several hundred fascists were killed in the houses where they slept. Some of them found rest in the streets of the village, some of them, throwing weapons without pants, taking advantage of the darkness, hid in the woods. In the morning, many hidden Hitlerites were taken out of cellars, attics, straw stacks, and given to us for payback. 4 days there was a fight in Kanzovka. Having overcome the resistance of the fascists, the regiments of the division began to penetrate further into the depths and approached the intended goal, the railroad near the town of Kotovsk. Germans, having found out the Soviet troops in the rear, made an attempt to destroy us. In the area of the village Felixovo II, they counterattacked with tanks, infantry, supported from the air by a large number of bombers. After a persistent heavy battle, the Nazi counterattack was repulsed. Our regiments and regiments of VDD came to the southwestern outskirts of Kotovsk. having cut the railroad main line near the city. Hitlerites, afraid to be surrounded, left the city of Belta during the night and began to withdraw from Kotovsk, throwing tanks, artillery, cars loaded with guns, ammunition, food and looted peaceful property, railway echelons and wagons. Some of them left on artillery and supply horses, some of them trying to get away from Russian retaliation as quickly as possible, on bulls, cows, and many of them even on foot, throwing their weapons, ran away to the west. The division was already in full strength together with other army formations began to pursue the retreating enemy. The characteristic was that the mood of German soldiers after the blow at Kotovsko became even more decadent. Morale fell even more. Meeting us, the population told us about the mood of the German soldiers, sang us songs that were sung by the retreating soldiers. War gone. War good. The wife is home. Return kaput. Nema kakao. Nema yakko. Goodbye, mistress. The villagers told us that they were not like the fascists of 1941, brave, well-fed, self-confident, who were organized on cars, motorcycles, on tanks with their heads raised up, smilingly marching through the streets. And when they began to flee under the blows of the Red Army, there was nothing like it anymore. Their appearance was pitiful. On foot, without cars, unorganized in small groups and alone, many without weapons, torn, dirty, tired, like beasts, angry, they chimed. Nema pig. No wine. Goodbye, Ukraine. Continuing to pursue the enemy, repulsing his counterattacks, on April 4, the division reached the Dniester River near the village of Gayani. Lieutenant General Managarov, the commander, ordered to force the Dniester from the move. The enemy stubbornly resisted. The attempt of the division units without crossing facilities, without artillery support to force the full flowing, wide river from the move was not successful. Having suffered heavy losses, the troops stopped the forcing. After 3 days of preparation, when our sappers and soldiers made ferries and other means of crossing from large wooden wine barrels, the division began to force the river near the village of Sibulevka. The high-water river was forcibly crossed with battles, thanks to the greatest courage and bravery of soldiers, sergeants and officers. Having forded the river under heavy artillery and mortar fire, the regiments of the division engaged in a fierce battle to expand the bridgehead captured on the right bank. The enemy undertook a number of counterattacks. He hastily introduced reserves into the battle. However, all his attempts to delay our advance had no success. And in the morning, like a bird, flew among the advancing soldiers fresh, just issued by the political department leaflet. It said, "Yesterday in the battles distinguished the soldiers of the company of Junior Lieutenant Mikhail Lavrenkov. They were the first to force the river, blew up the Germans' bunker and destroyed the calculation of the machine gun, which interfered with the forward movement. Machine gunner Ivan Sherstabitov supported the offensive of the riflemen by continuous fire of his machine gun. Junior Sergeant Kolobanov, a participant of the Civil War, beat Still Kolchak from Pita hit a tank. Station honor and glory to the heroes. Australians, double your steps and blows on the enemy, drive and exterminate fascist scoundrels. Forward, only forward." The offensive spirit was maintained and increased hourly. Officers of the political department several times a day informed the soldiers and commanders about the successes of the advanced units and neighbors. They not only identified the heroes of the battles, but also helped the headquarters to quickly formalize the submission on them for awards. Germans resisted with ferocity. We suffered losses from artillery and machine gun fire. The firing points were located in places difficult to detect. In this situation, Captain Ivanov's battalion rose up in a whirlwind. He captured a German battery, turned the guns toward the enemy and hit the enemy fire points. So the enemy clung to every hillock, every crater and bush. So knocking out the enemy from the defensive positions, reached the Prut River, the state border of the USSR, and then forced the river and transferred the fighting to the territory of Romania, freeing its peoples from fascist oppression. The transition of Soviet troops across the state border changed the political situation, set new tasks for the commanders and political departments of the division. It was necessary to direct the activities of commanders, political workers, party and Komsomol organizations, to quickly convey to all soldiers the essence of the statement of the Soviet government, which said that the entry of Soviet troops into the territory of Romania is dictated solely by military necessity, serves the cause of the final defeat of German fascism. The Soviet soldiers crossed the state border with Romania as liberators, clearly understanding that the working people of Romania did not want war against the Soviet Union, that the pro-fascist ruling circles of the country pushed it into an alliance with Hitler's Germany. Intelligence. Its essence and purpose is often defined figuratively. She, the eyes and ears of the commander, in any battle without her success is impossible. Chief of Staff of the division, Lieutenant Colonel Konstantin Mikhailovich Losko, called to him Pomkov Platoon Sergeant Borodulin. We need detailed data on the enemy defences in this area. He pointed out the area on the map. On the accuracy and speed of action, reconnaissance group will largely depend on the choice of direction of the main blow. Select the best scouts for the group. You will lead it, Filip Ivanovich. A few words about him. Sergeant Borodulin is an experienced warrior. He served on active duty. In 39th went to the Finnish War and in the harsh, frosty forests passed the school of battle hardening. When the thunderstorm of the 41st came, he went to defend his homeland from the invaders. Before leaving for the front, he worked at the Kushva metallurgical plant in the Sverdlovsk region. All his soldiers' hard way is connected with intelligence. In the division he served, fought in a separate reconnaissance company. The reconnaissance group of 9 men spent almost 2 days, day and night, conducting surveillance, studying the enemy's fire system, the location of trenches and trenches, convenient ways of approach to them. The front edge of the enemy's defence was along the edge of the forest. Separate trenches, apparently of the combat guard, were moved forward. At night, a group of sappers consisting of Sergeants Epifanov, Dushevich, and Private Shapovalov, Barinov, Tavshinik, made a passage in the wire fence and in the minefield. On a cloudy autumn night in the rain, the scouts, led by Borodulin, went for language. Bad weather dulled the vigilance of the enemy. The first to crawl along the passage began the movement of the capture group, followed by the supporting group. They crawled quietly, cautiously, with stops. Having overcome the zone of obstacles, the scouts approached the intended target. Eyes, accustomed to the darkness, looked around. The sergeant gestured to turn aside to go around the object. The group crawled to the rear. Everywhere was quiet, but the trained ear of the scout caught a quiet conversation in the trench. At Borodulin's signal, the scouts rushed into the trench. He himself stepped first. They appeared like ghosts over the fascists. Sergeant Efimov, Private Savchenko, Panzev, and all scouts bravely fought in hand-to-hand combat. In a short time they exterminated many fascists. Ober-Efreyator was gagged, tied his hands and dragged with him, without delay rolled back. Suddenly the scouts heard Germans talking ahead of them. They sat down and looked into the night gloom. A group of Hitlerites was coming towards the scouts, so 2 opposing reconnaissance groups met unexpectedly. Our scouts lay down, and as soon as the fascist group got close to each other, they hit with automatic rifles and threw grenades. The German group was destroyed. 1 Hitlerite was taken prisoner. This noise at the enemy position caused indiscriminate firing. The group of Sergeant Borodulin, by the same way, returned to their location with 2 prisoners, who gave valuable data about the enemy. For these skillful, decisive actions, the entire group of scouts was awarded. Sergeant Filip Ivanovich Borodulin received the Order of Glory, high degree. Looking ahead, I will say that Sergeant Borodulin, until the end of the war, still participated in many reconnaissance operations. Several led himself and took several tongues. Filip Ivanovich Borodulin was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of Glory in I degree, and the Medal for Bravery. He was promoted to the rank of Senior Sergeant. He participated in the Victory Parade in 1945 in March. After the war, he returned to his native town of Kushva, Sverdlovsk region, to the Municipal Military Enlistment Office, which drafted him into the Soviet Army. He began to work as a mechanic repairman in the railroad shop of the Goroblogodaysky mine. The clatter of the instrument of the miner's family and the soldier Filip Ivanovich is woven into the symphony of the mine.